So I'd like to introduce as the next speaker Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who we all know is a friend of Ukraine, a friend of the Congress, and a great supporter. Most recently, she was recognized by the Ukrainian government with the Medal of Princess Olha, First Class, which is awarded to women who have made outstanding contributions to the Ukrainian state in the fields of public services, science, and education. We all welcome Deputy Prime Minister Freeland.
І не забудьте про Романа Ващука, будь ласка. Треба його трохи привітати. Добре?
Дякую. Merci. Thanks. So we're supposed to just kind of chat it up here for a while about the issues that are animating all of us here in the hall, but also the issues where Chrystia has been making the link between Ukraine engagement, Ukraine advocacy, and the broader Canadian political and financial community, and the broader international political and financial community. And those of you who follow her remarks in various global fora may have seen her speech at the Brookings Institution a couple of weeks ago, where she said some pretty stark things. You said, "The sunny days are over. Bloody history is back." That's not a message that Canadians have been either delivering or hearing a whole lot. And so it comes as a bit of a shock to the system. I mean, you pointed out that the invasion of Ukraine ends a 33-year period of peace and general prosperity. So from within government of Canada and the international system, especially the financial side of it, how have our national leaders and how have global leaders reacted to this shock? And how has that realization, how can that realization help Ukraine to win?
Okay, Roman always starts with the easy, simple, straightforward questions. Я зараз відповім, але я хочу дуже коротко кілька вступних слів сказати. І, по-перше, я хочу просто всім сказати щиро дякую. Я вдячна за вашу роботу, я вдячна за вашу громадську активність. Я надзвичайно горда бути членом цієї нашої української громади в Канаді. Я надзвичайно горда вашої роботи вже роками і роками для нашої громади тут, у Канаді, і для Канади. І останнім часом я надзвичайно горда роботи нашої громади, кожної людини в цьому залі в підтримку України. Справді, щиро вам дякую. Et je veux dire aussi que je suis tellement fière aujourd'hui d'être canadienne. Nous avons vraiment un pays magnifique. Et je suis tellement fière d'être une Canadienne avec des racines ukrainiennes. Nous avons un pays bilingue, un pays qui a comme son politique officielle une politique de multiculturalisme. Et ces deux choses donnent énormément de puissance à notre pays, ici au Canada et dans le monde. And then finally, I just want to say, I was very touched to hear from the Lithuanian ambassador. And it is certainly true that Lithuania today is a very good friend of Canada in the world. And Lithuania is a very good friend of Ukraine. And by the way, has been for many centuries. All of us learned that in Ukrainian school. I have recognized that the Lithuanian-Canadian community, as you said, Ambassador, has been very strong in its support for the Ukrainian-Canadian community and for Ukraine in these difficult days. But I do, just in my opening comments, I just want to conclude by saying, you know, of course, I'm so proud to be Ukrainian-Canadian. I am so proud of all the amazing things. Yeah. Our community has done to build this country. But I really want to emphasize that Canada's support for Ukraine is first and foremost because it is in Canada's national interest to support Ukraine. We recognize that the battlefield in the world today between democracy and dictatorship is in Ukraine. Ukrainians are fighting for all of us, for all democracies. They're doing it with extreme resilience, with extreme courage, with extreme strategic brilliance. But I really want to emphasize that this really is a fight where all of us must support Ukraine, because Ukraine is fighting for our values. And it's very important to recognize that. And that really, Romana, is what you were asking about, right? You know, what are the stakes in Ukraine, and what has Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine changed? And really, the stakes are no less than the rules-based international order and then the strength of liberal democracy in the world. Now, I really think Putin underestimated, I think Putin had clear goals. I think his goals were to suppress and oppress Ukraine, but his goals were even larger than that. I think he wanted to show not only that Ukraine could be brought to heel, but that liberal democracy in the world was too weak and too lacking in self-confidence to support Ukraine. And I think he also wanted to show you, I think his was really a very revisionist effort to return the world to the 19th century, to a sort of age of Metternich, might makes right, game of the great powers kind of world. He wanted first and foremost to abolish the prohibition that Roman referred to, that we tried to establish after the Second World War and has held pretty solidly for the past 3 decades, that one internationally recognized sovereign state may not invade another. Those were Putin's objectives. And it is tremendously important that he not succeed. Of course, it's a life and death struggle for Ukraine, and I think President Zelensky put it extremely well in his speech to the British House of Commons when he said, "To be or not to be, that is the question we face." He has understood, and the people of Ukraine have understood, that this is an existential struggle. But even though that fight is very far away from us here in beautiful, sunny Winnipeg, we should make no mistake that values that are just as important to us, and not just values, but international rules and principles, are at stake for us as well. And that is why, as the Prime Minister said earlier today, Putin must fail. And let me also say, that's why Ukraine has to win. And I think we also, I want to conclude this answer, Romana, on a positive note. I think we shouldn't underestimate the positive momentum for democracy in Europe, Mr. Ambassador, and in the world that Ukrainian success is delivering and will deliver. I think what Ukraine is really showing us all is that liberal democracy really works, that people who are free that people who have a stake in their country and an ability to self-organize, that they can win against a foe who was seen as much, much more powerful. And I think that is very, very important also for all of us. Okay, Romane.
I'm not sure if you got the vibe when you were down in Washington at Brookings and elsewhere, but it would appear that there are quite a few people who are very stability-oriented in Western capitals who are afraid of Putin losing and Ukraine winning. What does Ukraine winning look like in a scenario that works for us and that works for Ukrainians, that works for everybody?
Well, look, Romane, I mean, I'm speaking to Cook and Cook delegates. I'm speaking to Ukrainian Canadians. So I know that everyone here is very passionate about the Ukrainian Canadian community and about Ukraine. But I think we all also recognize we're here safe in Canada. We are not in Ukraine. We are not on the front lines. And I always, when the question turns to what does victory look like, my first answer is, let's call up the Ukrainians. And the people who are going to decide, really determine when Ukraine wins, because I think it's a question of when, not if, and who are going to decide what that victory looks like, they are the Ukrainians. And I think that's very, very important for all of us to be very clear on and really recognize. But you've asked what victory looks like. And one element I think is worth underscoring is an essential part of victory for Ukraine must be that it is enduring. It must be that a Ukraine which has been victorious in the war, and as I've said, I am absolutely confident Ukraine will be, is a Ukraine which can be successful and prosperous and victorious in the peace. And so I think it is really important for all of us to be thinking about how can Ukraine be supported so that post-war Ukraine is a successful, prosperous, flourishing country. And I'll tell you something which a friend of mine, I think he probably won't mind being quoted, someone who has been working on Ukraine and close to Ukraine for a very long time, David Lipton, who was in the Treasury for a long time, then at the IMF, now is back in the Treasury. And he said to me shortly after this war began, shortly after Putin invaded Ukraine, he said what he had observed in the entire history of modern post-independence Ukraine was that every time Ukraine started to become economically successful, started to pick up momentum, the Russians would do something to thwart that success. And he had even observed in the period from 2014 to the February 24th invasion that every time you could see Ukraine kind of lifting off, every time you could see foreign investors starting to be more confident, there would be some kind of Russian provocation at the border. And I think that's a very smart observation. And what it says to me is, you know, Ukrainians are being incredibly brave, incredibly smart, incredibly effective on the battlefield. It's going to be equally important for them to be equally smart and brave and effective in building a really successful post-war Ukrainian state. I think the countries of the world can help with that, and I think our Hromada can help with that. And we should start thinking about that.
Вчора вечір я сидів на літаку, залітаючи до Вінніпегу, коло мене сиділа дуже симпатична старша пара із Гімлі, Манітоба. Не знаю, чи є тут хтось із Гімлі чи ні, чи з околиць. І вони мені розповіли, що до їхньої громади міської, to the CN camp somewhere on the outskirts of Gimli, тепер там проживають українці, вони, як багато інших людей, допомагають їм. Вони вже половину свого гаражу переглянули і передали українцям, так що радо приймають. Уже 100 тисяч таких людей приїхало до Канади, понад 100 тисяч, завдяки програмі QIT. Як з твоєї точки зору тимчасова чи постійна інтеграція тих людей відбувається, може відбуватися? Що це дає для Канади, що це дає для громади, що це може в майбутньому дати Україні?
Це прекрасне питання, Романе. Я хочу в першу чергу дуже подякувати всім українцям з Манітоби особливо. Я з Альберти, я живу тепер в Торонто, але родом я з Альберти. Ми завжди в Едмонтоні вважаємо і вважали, що у нас найкраща українська громада в Канаді. Я мушу сказати, в Торонто, Лесю, є також прекрасна українська громада, але останнім часом українська громада Манітоби справді себе показала. І так, ні, ви справді молодці. І як ви зараз вітаєте новоприбулих, це просто чудо. Я сьогодні рано, коли я приїхала сюди, просто там на литовищі ціла група українців приїхала тільки що, і їх там волонтери вітали. І я з ними всіма поговорила, і мені справді було приємно бачити, як це ефективно, чудово, прекрасно тут зорганізовано. Це не випадково, що перший рейс з України приїхав сюди до Вінніпегу. Було дуже велике лобіювання нашого уряду, до котрого міста перший рейс має приїхати. Вінніпег виграв, і я мушу сказати, ви прекрасно використовуєте цю можливість. Я дуже-дуже вам вдячна. Це дуже бідні люди, і ви дуже-дуже їх тепло приймаєте. То дуже-дуже вам дякую. І поза тим, Романе, я лише 2 слова скажу. По-перше, я думаю, що нам не треба забути, що наша головна ціль повинна бути допомогти Україні, щоб всі ті, що хочуть, могли вернутися до прекрасної, багатої країни з світлом, з теплом і без війни. А по-друге, я лише скажу, що я бачу, що ціла Канада дуже рада цими новоприбулими, що ціла Канада їх також дуже вітає. І я вчора була з Ентоні Блінкеном в Отаві, і він хотів, щоб перше місце, до котрого він пішов в Канаді, як тільки він вийшов з свого літака, це було до кафе «Кава» в Отаві, де приймають новоприбулих. Я думаю, що він хотів показати свою підтримку для України, але він також був надзвичайно вражений силою нашої української канадської громади, яка була дуже видна там. Дякую. Я горда вас.
So we can feel kind of special.
We are special, Romane.
Okay. We always have been special. The Canada-Ukraine relationship has been special. But there's lots of countries now in this space. I mean, Secretary Blinken, the US with its multi-tens of billions, the European Union, Australia getting into the Ukraine game, etc. What is what is the special sauce, if you will, for Canada now in its relations with and support for Ukraine?
Well, look, Romane, I mean, what you say is true, and I would say, now is a time when everyone is really interested in Ukraine. My own kids have said to me, Mama, suddenly, not only does everyone know where Ukraine is, they all think it's pretty cool to be Ukrainian. Так, ми завжди знали, але... But my first reaction is, it is great that countries other than Canada are extremely interested in having a good relationship with Ukraine. And I'll tell you guys a little story. I've shared with Lesia this slide deck. You guys probably you can't see it at all. But anyway, this is a slide deck which Serhiy Marchenko, the Ukrainian Minister of Finance, presented at a World Bank meeting just over 2 weeks ago, of all of the countries that are supporting Ukraine. And the slide deck shows how much money the government of Ukraine has received and from which sources since the war began. And if you guys see it, and Lisa can share it with you, I asked Serhiy after he showed the deck, is it okay for me to share it? And he sent the deck to me and said, yeah, sure. Actually, він сказав, так, можна. If you look at this, you will see that of non-Ukrainian sources, and this is not promised money, this is cash on the dash, money that has arrived in Ukraine. Number 1 is the US, number 2 is the entire European Union, and number 3 is Canada. So pretty good, Team Canada.
And that's in absolute terms, not in relative terms.
That is in absolute terms, okay? And as you may have noticed, we're not as big as the US or the EU. And when that deck went up, it was a surprise to some of the countries around the table. And I could see especially, and dear Ambassador, I'm sorry, some of our Baltic friends were a little surprised. They're used to the per capita charts. And they were like, whoa, and you guys are doing an amazing job. But they were like, whoa, Canada, you guys are really up there. And so I said in my remarks, I was like, look, it's fine with me if we want to have a competition on who's going to support Ukraine the most. That's good, right? So that's my first answer to Mane. But beyond that, I would say, look, Canada is smaller than other G7 countries. We're not that small. We're the 10th largest economy in the world. There's nearly 40 million of us. So, we have some real weight in the world. But when it comes to Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, I would say, Romane, the special sauce for us is the Ukrainian-Canadian community and the expertise that gives us. And what our government tries to do is leverage that knowledge and that expertise to play a leadership role in the G7, to come up with some new creative ideas and to work with our partners to put them in place. And a couple of examples would be the freezing of the reserves of the Russian central bank. That wasn't something Canada could ever do on its own, but that was something actually when the government of Ukraine said to us, hey, this would be a really good idea, we were able to sort of energetically encourage our partners to get behind, and it's had an effect. I'm hopeful that the Ukraine sovereignty bond, which the Prime Minister announced this morning, will be a similar kind of smart Canadian initiative, which encourages other countries to do the same.
And speaking of those bonds, so they're available to ordinary Ivan or Marichka Ukrainian Canadian.
Or Roman.
Or Roman, okay. But also to big institutional investors, right?
Yeah, so these bonds, and like, I know you supported the Prime Minister when he made this announcement, and he really deserves a huge amount of credit for doing this because, yeah, let's give him a hand. This is a big deal. Canada has never done this before, and no other country in the world has done this so far since the war started. The idea is that we know that there are a lot of people in Canada who would like to provide direct support to Ukraine and to the government of Ukraine, right? We know Ukraine needs help paying pensions. Ukraine needs help keeping the lights on. And if they can't do that, they can't win the war. But it's kind of hard to know, how do you get money directly to the government of Ukraine in a way that will be effective, where they'll get the money, where it's safe? And that's really the challenge that we set ourselves as we were thinking about this. And these Ukraine sovereignty bonds is the mechanism we've come up with. So we're going to issue bonds. They're going to be backed by a Government of Canada guarantee, so people can feel secure buying these bonds and to keep the rate of interest low, because the credit of the Government of Canada is good. As your finance minister, I can assure you of that. We're going to have, I want you guys, so we're going to have, for now, we're going to say that we're going to issue 500 million of these bonds. But if you guys as a Hromada keep on buying and buying and buying these bonds, why don't you bust through the limit and give me a challenge to step up further? That's my challenge to you. What's special about these bonds, as you say, Romane, is they will be available to retail investors. We're working with Canadian financial institutions, including credit unions, so that people can buy the bonds there. So it's something that I'm really excited about. I personally, I'm sure everyone in this room gets this also. I can't walk down the street anywhere in Canada without people coming up to me and saying, hey, we know you, you're Chrystia Freeland, you're Ukrainian Canadian, how can we support Ukraine? And this will be a very clear and positive way of doing it. And maybe just the final thing to say, because you guys are all Ukraine experts, the way the money will go to Ukraine is Canada working with the IMF, very much with Yulia Kovalyev, who helpfully used to work at the Ministry of Finance, so she knows what she's talking about on this stuff. We've set up a special administered account at the IMF. And so the money from these bonds will go into that account. It's how Canada has been making its contributions to Ukraine. And the money from that account goes directly to the Ukrainian Ministry of Finance. Because it's administered by the IMF, it has that extra degree of transparency and accountability that is important to all of us, and it should be.
Okay, and maybe finally, coming back to your Brookings talk of a couple of weeks ago, you talked about the idea of friendshoring. Not offshoring, not nearshoring, friendshoring, which is countries that are like-minded, that share values, that share economic beliefs and systems, should primarily work with each other in value chains. Now, given that there's going to be there's already a lot of thinking about recovery, rebuilding, modernization of Ukraine, how can Ukraine become part of friendshoring for the future? And there they are.
Whoa.
There's Canada. Hey,
Bless
that's
you.
right. There it is.
Yeah. So
Just
pretty good,
above
guys,
Germany. Oh dear.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes. So how can it join all these friends in value chains and building the prosperous world of the future?
Yeah, Romane, I think that is an excellent question. And in starting to answer it, I'm just going to go back for one moment to when you and I first met in 1989. It's a long story, but basically Roman helped to rescue me. So дякую тобі дуже. It was still the Soviet Union. And important things were happening then, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And you and I both were very present in first the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union. And I think we all knew that real euphoria. And, you know, it's easy today to kind of mock that notion of the end of history. I think it was a very powerful and hopeful idea. This idea that all the countries of the world were moving towards liberal democracy, that was both possible and inevitable. And there was a period when that was sort of the guiding notion of Western statecraft. And I really believe, you know, there have been reasons to be skeptical of that for a while, but Putin's invasion of Ukraine has really, you know, shattered that. And I think the realization has been particularly powerful for the countries of Europe, because many of them have found themselves so economically dependent on Russian energy, particularly Russian gas. And so I think what you're seeing from the EU, very much from Secretary Janet Yellen, the US Secretary of the Treasury, is this notion that we need to think more about resilience when we are building our supply chains. When we're thinking about our international economic relationships, of course, we need trade. Canada is a trading nation. That's very, very important for us. But where we need to be vulnerable to other countries, let's be strategically vulnerable to our friends and our allies. I think there is huge economic opportunity for Canada in that geopolitical shift. So, dear Ukrainian Canadians, let's work hard on that. And as you suggested, Romane, there is huge opportunity for Ukraine, given its geographic location, which for much of Ukrainian history has been a curse. But I think when it comes to the age of European friendshoring, Ukraine's geography can also be a blessing. And I'm going to turn the tables on you a little bit, Romane, because as you guys know, Roman is kind of an expert not only in the Ukrainian economy, but in everything that is happening in Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think you've already seen some examples of Ukraine becoming a part of European friendshoring.
Yeah. So, yeah, last week I was at the Krynica Forum in southeast Poland, which of course is in the traditional Lemko homeland. But coming back from that, my Polish host took me to this factory in Nowy Sącz, and interestingly, we had with us a Chinese lawyer. And what he saw shocked him, because what he realized was that this is a market segment. This is roof windows, the kind of tilting windows you put in your roof if you live in a fairly temperate part of the world, where this Polish company was number 2 in the world, number 1 in some segments, had a workforce of 2,500 in Poland, but then also a workforce of nearly 600 in Ukraine, which they had established 3 plants because they had shut down their manufacturing operation in China, because they felt that having a nearshore arrangement with Ukraine where they could simply truck things back and forth would be optimal for their competitive model. And they sell around the world, including in Canada. So I think that's the kind of practical example of how this can be made to work in the future. And it means, though, a much more seamless EU-Ukraine border that allows just-in-time deliveries instead of just as soon as the truck driver spends 5 days camping at the border deliveries. So still working on that. But I think that's the kind of realistic prospect Ukraine has.
Okay, bravo.
Actually, and vice versa. Ukrainian companies having satellite facilities in the EU. Because one of the things that people have realized is that Ukraine is not just an object either politically or economically, but a subject with entrepreneurs who can be world-beating given half a chance.
Okay. Вже кінець? Окей, я думаю, ми вже закінчуємо. Так, Романе, я
думаю,
одне
що так.
слово скажу.
Ми вже самі зголодніли.
Так, ми зголодніли, всі голодні. Окей, я хочу лише на закінченні два слова сказати. The first is one of the strengths of Canada's Ukrainian-Canadian community and of Canada is for a long time we have approached Canada's support for Ukraine as a cross-party issue. We've understood that it is in the Canadian national interest to support Ukraine. And I think that the Ukrainian-Canadian community, all the activists who are here, have contributed a lot to that approach. And, you know, I see James Bizan here, leaders from other parties. And I do, you know, want to recognize how important that cross-party approaches and cross-party support for Ukraine is. It makes it easier. Лесю, ти вже то не показала. It makes it easier for Canada to be up there on the leaderboard. It makes the Canadian voice in international fora much, much stronger. А тоді на кінець я мушу сказати останнє слово по-українськи. І то я справді, я дивлюся на цей зал, я повно людей тут знаю. Із Едмонтону, із Вінніпегу, із Торонто, із цілої Канади. І я хочу лише підкреслити, яка я горда є вас всіх. Активність нашої громади надзвичайна. І це є активність, яка будує не лише нашу громаду, але вже з самого початку, з першого дня, що перші українці приїхали до моєї Альберти, хочу підкреслити, з того першого дня громадська активність українців у Канаді будує так само Канаду. І мені дуже приємно це признати, дуже приємно бути з вами. Я дуже горда вас. Слава Україні!